NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
The biggest mistake that defense attorneys make when challenging police officer credibility in the courtroom is believing that everybody else sees the police the same way we do. Now, am I saying there aren't officers out there who are lying, who are planting evidence in our clients, who are the devil in disguise? No. But in most cases, whether or not that is the case, whether or not there's actual police misconduct or a case rises and falls on the credibility of an officer who takes the stand and may even be telling the truth, we have to challenge that credibility. And the only way we can do that is to stop seeing police officers, again, from the lens of our experience and starting to look at the way the rest of the world sees them. So what we're going to do today is talk about just that. We're going to talk about how people make decisions about credibility in cases. How do they decide whether or not anyone, but especially police officers, are telling the truth? Next, we're going to talk a little bit about how social perceptions and the way we grew up and our environment and what's on the news impact our credibility judgments. We'll talk about the social perceptions that our fact finders, be they judges or juries, have about police officers specifically. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to build a counter-narrative in motions and at trials, whether you're before a judge or a jury, that take all of that into account. So let's start by talking about how people make decisions. There are two sides of our brain. There are two decision-making systems, I should say. The intuitive system and the deliberative system. The intuitive system of our brain is just what it sounds like. It's our gut. It's our initial reaction when we're confronted with a situation or a problem where we have to make a decision. The other side is the deliberative side. That's the part that kicks in and may change a decision when we've had time to think it, to weigh it, to evaluate it. The bad news is 95% of the 20,000 decisions that we all make every day come from the intuitive side, essentially our guts. And of those 95% of decisions, 79 to 93% of them are made based on our own experiences and the way that we have walked through the world. So what does that mean? Well, it means that every time a juror or a judge is coming into the courtroom, they're carrying all that with them, and their intuitive systems are on fire. Now, Chris Guthrie at Vanderbilt University has been doing some amazing research over the last 20 years about judicial decision-making. And he has studied the way judges make decisions. And one of the things that he wanted to do is see whether judges were any different than the regular folks, than all of us, in making decisions, in the way they decided. Were they better decision makers? Were they more deliberative? It will not shock anyone in this room to find out that judges' brains work exactly like ours. They'd have the exact same predisposition to decide things from their gut that the rest of us do. So what does that mean for the way we practice? This is an adorable dog, right? Aw, he's cute. What if I told you this? A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They heard dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and ate it for dinner. Ew? Are most of us kind of in our gut going, ew, that's gross? If you're not, don't raise your hands. Right, ew, right? That's kind of gross. But what if I told you it was the middle of winter, it was in Barrow, Alaska, the family had been socked in for weeks. There was a storm, there was no food getting to town, there was no food getting to their house. They were starving. And the dog got killed in front of the house and they decided to eat it. Still maybe gross, but some of you might be thinking, all right, in that limited situation, I will let you eat the dog, right? And that's what we're doing in these cases, right? Why do I say that? And I love the name of the study is it wrong to eat your dog? So this line represents overall confidence in police. It's the most recent Gallup poll study. It's from 2018, but reflecting 2017. Attitudes towards police, and I have not been able to find a new one, so I believe that this is the most recent one. And if you'll notice something, is confidence in police is nearing all-time highs. Why is that? Well, the Gallup poll tells us there's been a drop in confidence in police amongst Hispanics, liberals, and younger adults, millennials. We also know from the study that African American confidence in police typically hovers at much lower rates than other racial and ethnic groups. I don't have to explain to people in this room why that might be, but it covers around 35%, and it doesn't usually change from year to year. So that has remained relatively static. So what's accounting then for the uptick in that line? It's a rise. The rise in white confidence in the police, white people's confidence in the police is so substantial that it actually outpaces and makes up for the decline in the other categories. And I don't know how meaningful this is depending on where you practice and depending on what the composition of your juries look like. But this can be a real problem in places where you are communicating to all white juries. So that means that regardless of what state you're in or where you practice, right, because these are national trends, it may be higher in certain areas of the country, but regardless, looking at those national trends, every time we seat a jury of 12, 7 of them walk into that room predisposed to believe what a police officer is going to say, with a high degree of confidence in members of law enforcement. And what are we doing? We're trying to serve them dog, right? We're trying to get them to say, just this one time, I'm going to believe that a police officer is not telling the truth. Now, when we look at this thing, I'm not worried about the gray people, right? Those are our people. The people in gray, we like them. Everything we say is going to work on them. Everything we talk about today is going to help our gray people maybe turn our red people to be gray people. We like gray people. So I'm suggesting that we're going to talk to people the same way, but when we're thinking about our juries, or thinking that 7 out of 12 judges are predisposed to believe the police, I personally believe that number might be higher. I don't know. But regardless, right, every time we go in, we have to be thinking this person or this judge is red, and how am I going to turn them gray? How am I going to get them to eat the dog just this one time? So we have to talk about a couple of concepts that come up continually in Guthrie's research and sort of echo other research in decision-making and credibility generally. And I'll tell you, one of the things I really like about Guthrie's research is, unlike all previous researchers who have studied appellate judge decision-making, so decisions that people are making from cold and sort of sterile appellate court records, Chris Guthrie is studying trial judges' decision-making, which, as we know, to a large extent, particularly in drug cases, comes down to whether or not they believe the state's witnesses, and in every drug case, there's going to be some cops, right? So I think it's an important distinction, is he's one of the only people out there doing this. And there's something that comes up time and time again in his research, and it's this concept of system override, right? Judicial override. How do we get people who have that initial reaction? Sure, he's a police officer, he has to be telling the truth. How do we start to get that person to change their mind, especially when they have such strongly held fixed beliefs about their confidence in police? Well, what his studies have showed us is that judges rely on intuition, but they'll sometimes override it with deliberation. But it's a mild proclivity to override. And by that I mean, it's really the act of being told that they are judging that might make them deliberate a little bit more for making a decision, not the fact that being a judge gives them any more training or experience. So when we tell a juror, and I will tell you this is not in a study, I'm sort of extrapolating, but when we tell a juror, you are now a judge of the fact, right? We tell them that in the opening instructions. What we're telling them is put your deliberative hat on, and that may produce a mild, yet statistically insignificant inclination to think a little bit more before making a decision. But the fact that people are dubbed judges is not going to save us here. So I want you to be aware as we talk today about three concepts that come up, three things we need to know about, actually, I should say. Three things we need to know about when we're attempting to convince somebody to sort of change their mind from their initial gut reaction. The first is this concept called anchoring. And what anchoring means is exactly what it sounds like. And I can give you an example in the context of a sentencing. So say that I am arguing, the sentencing range is 10 to 20. I'm arguing to the judge that my client should get a 10. The state wants a 20. The judge is going to read the pre-sentence report, whatever initial paper she gets, and she's going to say, I'm thinking about a whatever. And then, regardless of how good I am at giving a sentencing argument, how compelling, how eloquent I am by the time of sentencing, if the judge has set the anchor at 12, maybe I can get a 10. Maybe the prosecutor can get a 14, but the prosecutor ain't getting a 20. And conversely, and as usually is the case, if the judge has set the anchor at 18, I might get down to a 16 with my compelling legal argument, but I'm not getting anywhere close to 10. And what that tells us is something that we've been saying for years, and hopefully you've heard over and over again coming to these conferences, is that you can't start telling the story of your case at the end. You can't wait till closing in a drug case to talk about the credibility of the police officers. You can't wait until oral argument. Now, how many times have I heard, and you've all said it, I've done it, I'm just gonna save my arguments for save everything for after everybody testifies at my motion to suppress. Too late. We have to start thinking about telling the judges right up front. One of the newer attorneys in our office is here for these 2 days, and we were having this conversation last night with a bunch of people who I'm not going to say are old, but have been around for a while. And we were talking about people who waive opening. And she's like, that's a thing? And I said, I love the fact that you don't know that's a thing, right? Because we're teaching people now the importance of opening, the importance of opening strong and hard to the facts that you have. And this is why. We want juries and judges to set the anchor when they read the first brief or set the anchor when they hear our opening statements. We want to win then and then keep the momentum going. And we'll talk about how to do that. So the next concept you need to be aware of is something called the identifiable victim effect. And if I hope that later people aren't like, she just gave a talk about like abusing dogs, right? That's not the intent here. But I have my Sarah McLachlan picture. Identifiable victim effect is this. This comes from advertising and marketing, where people were they were trying to figure out how to get the most money for charitable organizations through advertising. And they would show, they did it in the context of homeless children, where they would show a group of people a video of one homeless child and tell the story of that one homeless child. They'd show another group of people the video of the statistics about there are 7 million children starving across the United States. And then the last group would see the story of the one child who was starving, and then they would roll over statistics. There's 6 million other children just like this starving child. Guess who got the most money? The single starving child. And what does this tell us? This tells us that stories of our individual client, stories of the character in our case, sometimes stories of the police officers in our cases, are going to be more compelling to a judge or a jury than facts, than cold hard facts. And as we talk about over and over again, and I'm sure you've heard, it's the emotions. Emotions cause people to act. Emotions are one of the ways that we get people to go with their gut, but to go with their gut in a way that's helpful to us, by injecting the human story of our clients and the police officers in these cases. And then finally, there's something called cognitive dissonance that we have to be aware of. We're going to talk a little bit more about this a little bit later on. But cognitive dissonance meaning that people will willingly kind of set aside or filter information through the lens that comports with their worldview. So if there's somebody who always believes police officers tell the truth, they're going to give the officer the benefit of the doubt. They might hear a fact that sounds pretty bad to us, who are more distrustful of police officers, and say, oh, well, but it was a mistake. Or, oh, it was a long day, right? They're going to excuse facts that come into evidence. And we know that this is happening with our judges and juries because of all of the evidence, the more video evidence that we have in court, which we'll talk about in a minute. But how this starts to begin to inform our practice is that we can't wait until oral argument or closing arguments to try to win our cases. The best closing argument should be one where you're kind of looking at the jurors and they're like, yeah, why are you here? We know this, right? And we can't wait, and I think this is the more important point, because I think you all know that. I think the more important point is we can't wait to do it in motions either. We have to start taking everything we know about trying cases and applying them to motion practice. And we also know from all this that facts aren't going to save us. And what do I mean by that? We can see that the facts in these cases are going to be filtered through the lens of the judge. So if we don't command that lens, if we don't turn that lens in the right way, the facts are just going to wash over them. And the law is not going to save us either, because what is the law when it comes to drug cases? What is the law when it comes to the Fourth Amendment? What is the instruction on reasonable doubt if you're lucky enough to be in a state that has an instruction on reasonable doubt, right? Probable cause is facts and circumstances. It's always the totality of the circumstances. What does that mean? Flexible, common sense, fact specific. The law in search and seizure is essentially whatever the judge decides the facts are. Judge decides the facts are, right? And the same thing with reasonable doubt. A doubt based on common sense and reason. That's from our instruction. You probably have something similar. How do we decide what's common sense and reasonable? From the facts. What facts do we believe? So that's why I say the law won't save us and the facts won't save us either. Because if they did, things like motor vehicle recordings and body cameras would actually matter, right? How many of you have been in a court where you see the body camera footage and you're like, oh yeah, look, he turns it off right before they consent. This is awesome, I'm gonna win. And you go in and the judge doesn't care. Are you watching the same body camera footage that I am? Because the officer just reached up and turned off the camera. But as soon as he gets up there and he says, well, I was needed to conserve the battery for later in my shift, or whatever stupid excuse he gives, the judge is just like, huh, okay. Because he's filtering it through that lens. And we see really extreme cases. The news is full of cases of police officer misconduct. We're seeing databases being developed. We have, unfortunately, over the last 10 or 15 years, seen people shot on the evening news. And that's why I say the facts won't save us. Because what's a better fact than a videotape? And sometimes those things don't even matter. So we can't rest our laurels if we have an image or a video. We've got to keep in mind how to create a narrative around them. And I wanted to I want us to think a little bit too about the reason for this, right? What is the reason why we can see a videotape of something and all actually see something different in it?
Why we disagree about facts. So I've had a lifelong interest in trying to understand how humans perceive the world and each other. And we tend to think of perception as visual perception. So light bounces off of an object, reflects back onto our retinas, which transports the signal along the optic nerve to the visual cortex, where some complex information processing occurs, and that's how we view objects. But if that were the whole story, then how is it possible that we can all look at the same facts, the same evidence, the same risks, and arrive at radically different conclusions about what they mean? And that is because our perceptions are inherently social. And the first time that I realized how social the nature of our perception is was during my undergraduate degree, where I came across this classic social psychology experiment, where Solomon Asch asked participants to match the line you see on the left to one of the three other lines on the right. Now, I know what you're thinking. Clearly, the answer is C. And that's right. We all have a motivation to perceive the world as it is. But we also have competing motivations, more social motivations. And so the experimenter wanted to see What if all the other participants systematically gave the wrong answer? Would the real subject of the experiment then also conform to the norm of the group, or would they still give the accurate answer? And what they found was actually quite striking, that although there was variation on a large number of trials, 75% of individuals at least conformed once, meaning that they willingly distorted their perceptions of reality to conform to the norm of the group. And this is quite striking. Now you might think, what does this experiment from the 1950s tell us about the situation that we currently find ourselves in?
That is a very good question. And so what does that tell us about the situation we find ourselves in? Well, when we think about juries, a collection of people who are all looking at the same evidence, right? If too many of those people are asserting that they're seeing something the same way, it may convince other people to conform, to ignore what their own eyes and ears have told them to be true, to conform with the norms of the group. So we got to start thinking about convincing the rest of the group, convincing those folks that were in red on our little jury chart, so that those gray people will be able to kind of bring them along, and that these kinds of things don't happen. And the same is true of judges. Judges talking about their cases. The judge who doesn't want to go back to his fellow judges and tell them that he suppressed the kilo of cocaine in the trunk, right? So this applies to judges just as well. So what do we have to start thinking about? An important thing that we have to think about as we do these cases is, what is the judge or jury, and if I did not clarify before, I'm essentially using those interchangeably, because there's zero difference in my mind in the way that you try cases to judges or juries or do motions versus trials. Well, what is the fact finder seeing when the officer takes the stand in your particular case, right? The hero, the dangerous stop on the side of the road, the friendly officer just asking nicely for identification. And what is he seeing when he looks at your client? Drugs, guns, fleeing from the police, all of those things. So we have to take a step back and say, not what do we see when we read the discovery, but what do they see? What does that judge see when she's looking down at our client from the bench? And how do we use that to educate the way we proceed, for example, in a motion to suppress? And I know what you're thinking. You might be saying, look, I've got mad skills. I don't know if you know who you're talking to. You might be saying, I know how to cross. You might have been here this morning to see Larry Posner. Now you really know how to cross, right? I know how to do this. I've been doing this for years, right? So as of right now, everything that you have learned about doing motion practice, everything that you've learned about arguing the case law and doing the research and having the most compelling legal argument really doesn't mean anything. Because all of this research has shown us that people are still making decisions emotionally. So if you're bombarding them with facts, you're not getting anywhere. So I'm not going to ask you to forget everything that you know. I'm not going to ask you to say, oh, well, then it's good that the Fourth Amendment guy couldn't be here, right? I'm not asking you to do any of that. What I'm asking you to do is to layer on your trial advocacy skills and start to think about these motions and to think about these arguments even to judges as trials. So I'm going to give you a new approach. Now, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about motions. And I'm going to kind of refer to motions from now on. We may depart to jury trials here and there. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I think we're all pretty good at storytelling in trials, right? We all get it. We're on at trial. We're ready. Sometimes we're going through the motions at a motion, right? Sometimes we're not thinking as much about our emotions and how they're worded and what we're putting into our emotions. So I want to talk about all of this through the lens of emotion because it's much more difficult. But everything that I'm saying here could apply equally to trials. So what I want you to do when you have a case, that you're preparing a motion to suppress, the first thing I want you to do is to write out the sequence of events in the order that they happened. That's easy. That's task one. The next thing is find the tipping point. What is the point at which this stop goes sideways for the state? Where is your best legal argument within that sequence of events? Next, What's the law that applies to the tipping point, right? We do have to do some law, fine. We're not going to talk much about that. And then finally, think through the emotional and social perceptions, or the emotions, that are implicated in that moment, not just for your client, but for the police officer. And then finally, to build a counter-narrative around that. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. Call comes from the Red Roof Inn. I think the people in room 209 have drugs in there. Anonymous call. So what do the police decide to do? Go to the Red Roof Inn and knock on the door and say, "Hi, we're the police." They knock on the door and some guy peeks out the window. After said guy peeks out the window, he says to some other guy, "The fucking cops are outside." They hear two people walking around, but nothing more than that. And they're assuming that there's two people because somebody's talking to another guy. They tell the guys come back to the door and open it, and they say, "Come outside and stand here." Then the officer does something. He puts his little foot in the door, just enough to hold the door open so that it doesn't close and lock like hotel room doors do. He looks through the little hole that he has made with his little foot. He sees a chore boy inside, which to him is indicative of drug use, because it's doubtful that they were cleaning the hotel room. And then finally, after 9 minutes of the two co-defendants, who later become co-defendants, standing outside in the hallway, his backup officers arrive. One of them stands with the two suspects. The other goes inside the hotel room and finds lots of drugs in the hotel room. So where's our tipping point? Right? That's okay. You don't have to shout it out. I'll tell you. So our tipping point is probably here. I think legally, I like best him shoving his foot in the door because I'm not sure what gave him any kind of legal cause to be able to do that. So I like that. That's my strongest legal argument. Now, there may be others, right? Maybe we have, could they have gone into the room? Could they have asked them to step outside? Could they knock on the door in the first place, right? So we may have identified other legal issues. And every appellate lawyer, I get in trouble with appellate lawyers a lot. Every appellate lawyer will tell you, you have to make sure that you cite all the legal bases. So I'm not suggesting you abandon everything but your tipping point. But I'm suggesting as you're thinking about how to do your cross, how to structure your narrative, all that, we're thinking about it through the lens of the tipping point, which is here. So why is that important? Because we're like, oh, we won. This is a great legal issue for us. He can't stick his foot in the door and then look inside this apartment. That's not enough. We can't lock it down there. Why? Because what's the judge thinking? And when we look through this through the lens of our judge, well, our judge doesn't know what's out inside that door. Those poor police officers who might put themselves in danger going into that hotel room, right? The prosecutors made her think that
on one end of the spectrum.
Oh, sorry. Has made them think that this is a really dangerous people, a dangerous situation for, I'm sure somebody wrote somewhere in some report for their own personal safety. They had to keep the door open, right? That's nonsense. But why does that lens matter?
On one end of the spectrum, we have something called selective attention, meaning it's an on and off switch, and we selectively attend to the things that we find important, and we disregard things that are irrelevant to us, and that's completely natural. We need to have a filtering mechanism to try to understand the world. Confirmation bias, though, is the tendency to process information more fluently when we agree with it, when it agrees with our pre-existing worldviews and beliefs, and stuff that doesn't agree with us is more difficult to process. So we have a bias towards confirming those type of facts that we already agree with, and that's confirmation bias. That works some of the time. At other times, it can be more complicated. What's really troubling, though, is this notion of motivated reasoning. So motivated reasoning is just not only selectively attending to evidence, confirming those facts that fit with your prior worldview, but also to have a deep motivation to then actually reject any evidence to the contrary, to actually distort our perceptions of the facts because they don't fit with what we believe.
So this is what we were talking about earlier, but kind of on steroids, right? So if the judge digs into this prosecutor's idea that these people are in this hotel room are dangerous, and we don't do anything to confront that, anything to try to bolster our emotions in the case, our story in the case, What's going to happen is the judge is not only going to be predisposed to believe the police officer, may even have this motivated reasoning to twist and distort the facts to fit that worldview. Does that sound like any decisions you read in motions to suppress? Sounds like a lot of mine, right? Judges twisting and distorting things to make sure it fits into the prosecutor's narrative. That's why we take control of the narrative up front. Because what does the judge see in this case? Right? Like people just sitting around a hotel room with a mountain of coke and a gun, right? That's what the judge is seeing. So we have to take control. How do we do that? So we're going to talk for the rest of our time about 8 steps to building a counter-narrative. And this is sort of a machine gun approach. There's going to be a lot of different ideas for the way you can construct these narratives to judge and juries, and they're going to fall in 8 categories. I will tell, and here they are. I'm not going to read them to you. There are materials with your handouts. I had previously written an article for the Champion about crossing cops and credibility issues, and it's included in your materials. The 8 steps are different, so I just wanted to let you know that, like, I don't have 2 personalities or something. These 8 steps, to me, are more important specifically for drug cases, and we're going to talk to them about drug cases, where the other article is like just a little bit more general. So the first thing we want to do is tell stories, right? The identifiable victim effect. We want to tell stories through the lens of our client, through our client's experience, through the injustice that our client has been subjected to at the hands of the police. And how do we do that? We use our words really carefully. The caption for this photo could be the officer put the man in handcuffs. That same caption applies to this photo. They are 2 very different photographs, right? I can say to you, the officers knocked on the door 3 times and announced their presence, and after several minutes, the occupant opened the door and asked them if there was a problem. That kind of gives me this picture. The officers knocked on the doors and on the windows with their fists. They screamed police, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times. When no one answered, they knocked again until after several minutes, Claire Johnson opened the door just enough to pop her head through and ask the officers, is there a problem? I couldn't find a great picture for this, but that might give you this, right? It gives you more of that stormtrooper image that you're looking for. And that's not, all of these would be facts that you'd get from a police report. I'm not asking you to go into argument, saying make the facts work for you the same way you would in an opening statement when you write the facts section of your briefs. So here's an example for the hotel room case. 9 minutes. For 9 minutes, Sergeant Agents and Patrolman Jackson of the Anytown Police stood outside room 209 of the Red Roof Inn. The occupants were with them. They were not free to leave. They were forced to stand outside with armed and uniformed officers, forced to wait for the detective to arrive. During those 9 minutes, Abrams used his feet and hands to keep the door of room 209 propped open wide, giving me a clear view of the interior. During those 9 minutes, Abrams let the opportunity to call for a telephonic warrant to pass him by. During those 9 minutes, the officers didn't hear as much as a whisper coming from room 209. The events that led up to this moment neither justify ordering the occupants out of the room, their home for the night, nor do they justify entry into room 209. That's the facts section of your brief. The beginning of it, at least. Not on October 4th, 2007, officers responded to the Red Roof. Right, that's like repeating the direct, the cardinal sin of cross. And we do it all the time in motions. So take the moment, take the tipping point, make it emotional, make it vivid, using your facts the same way you would in an opening statement, and put it up front. You can always go back. So you want to begin with what's most important to your story? Don't go chronologically. The prosecutor went chronologically, and chronological is usually bad, because it's usually officers who see somebody with drugs in their hand. Officer gets a call that your client has drugs, right? Chronological generally does not work for criminal defendants because the crime usually comes first, right? And then think about places where, and then you're going to backtrack, right? So, Your Honor, assuming that you don't buy my fabulous argument that he couldn't stick his foot in the door, let's talk about the anonymous tip, right? And then you do that section, right? So you can always go back. They're like mini chapters, kind of. And then you want to think about places where visual aids will help. And what do I mean by that? So this is a great article. It was from the I forget who it's from. It's from a bar association, I think the Georgia Bar Association, where they talk to judges about what they want to read. And the judges say, shoot for compelling yet concise introductions, a restrained use of case law, and modern diction. So basically, judges are saying, start strong, don't cite a lot of law to us, and keep it brief and interesting and conversational. It was Justice Kennedy who said, I've never read a brief that I couldn't put down, right? Give them a brief they can't put down and make it visual. Now today, with modern technology, with surveillance cameras, body cameras, photographs, hopefully the police officers are taking pictures of more stuff. You've got a lot of visuals that you can use in your emotions. They don't replace the words. You need both, the words and the pictures. But if you got the pictures, it's nice. So this is from a motion to suppress where I had a body camera video. I took a still of the tipping point, which was this moment. I'm not going to tell you the facts, it doesn't matter. And I stuck it in the brief. So the judge can read about it, or he can look at the pictures. Don't we all like to do that when we're reading? We can skim through and look at the pictures. That's a nice picture. That's a picture that encapsulates the lack of probable cause in my case. And you can do this. So this is, you don't need to read these words. This is a sample of another motion in that same case that was on the last slide. I just wanted you to see visually what the motion looks like. Right? So it starts with a fancy introduction that includes the 1-minute video that was the tipping point of this motion. And the issue was whether or not this woman Green was in custody. Embed the video into the motion so when the judge opens it on his computer, he can click on it and see the 1 minute that you think is most important. Because you think he's going to go through the evidence, take out the CD, put it in his computer, find the part where you say is important, and watch it, you're crazy. It's just not going to happen. So make it easy and have a backup attached to a thumb drive that he could pop in if it doesn't work, right? Use your pictures. These are crime scene photos that were stitched together to show like a 360 view of what she was looking at when she was sitting in the police car. Sirens and lights everywhere. She's in custody. Chart showing everything she was ordered to do. You can also use this in oral argument. This was the PowerPoint presentation of the oral argument in this case, a slide from it at least. Layering the commands by the officer on top of the photographs that prove that that was happening at the time I say it's happening. I want control of the narrative. This is how you take control of the MVR, how you take control of the video. He doesn't need to watch it. If you're pasting the words that are said on top of a picture, you're making the judge's job easy. So, visual, think visually. Wherever you can embed a visual, try to do it. But it doesn't replace the words, you do both. So go to the scene. We know how important it is to go to the scene, right? We all know this. This is 101. In a drug case, especially, go with your client if possible. Ever gone to a place where there's a lot of drugs being dealt? No, never, right? Everybody in this room should be raising your hand, but it's okay. It was probably a long night. I'm going to let you slack. Right? Everybody has done that. Ever gone with your client? It is totally different when the person who is alleged to have been dealing drugs in that area is with you. People suddenly are willing to talk to you. People suddenly are fine with you coming in and showing you around. Right? So if you can bring your client to a scene with you, and I'm not suggesting that anybody's intimidating anybody or anything like that, but it's like, do you see John Smith here? You say John was out here that day with you. Is he here? And he looks around the playground and he goes, hey, John. John comes over and gets an interview with the investigator, right? It's so much easier to find your witnesses if your client is with you or to get the lay of the land. I don't know, when I show up to a I'm going to say high crime area, we're going to talk about that later. But when I show up to an area where there is drug dealing supposedly going on, somebody yells child services and everybody runs. Because they always assume that I'm from child services. I must have that look about me. I don't know, right? So if you're going with your client, people are going to stay around. They're going to wonder, and you have somebody saying, she's okay, you can talk to her. So that's just one of the myriad of reasons you go to the scene. You also want to think about what the officer did, and then say, if I was the officer and I was perfect, what are all the things I would have done? And make a list of those. And then we're gonna take a breath before we spring into action, which we're gonna talk about, we're gonna put a pin in and talk about a little bit later. So, surveillance locations. Do you get these undisclosed? I'm just looking at my time. Okay. Do we get these undisclosed surveillance locations? Yes. Like I was somewhere, I'm not going to tell you, right? We get them. In New Jersey, and you might have different rules. In New Jersey, we can usually get, if the court is willing to protect the location, we can usually get the distance, whether somebody was elevated or not, sometimes whether or not they were in a house. So we do these hearings. If you have those hearings in your state, get as much information as you can without them disclosing the location if that's what the court has ordered. And then you play a game that I like to call pin the tail on the surveillance location. And here's how this game works. And it's super fun, and you would be surprised how often it actually works. So this is a case of mine, and I'll tell you what's funny about this. This case is old. It's from 10 years ago, but it's my favorite example of pin the tail on the surveillance location, so I still use it. So the allegation was that my client was dealing drugs at this location, that he would sit in the chair, he walked to the end of his driveway. He lived in the White House, the all-white house to the right, but his chair was closer to the house on the left. He would walk to the front, he would sell the drugs, and he'd go back to his chair. Now, I tried this case in 2011, and I just pulled up this picture on Google Earth. This makes me so happy. And this is the only room where I could say this makes me so happy. The chair's still there. In 2018, 7 years later, the chair is still there in the same spot. But anyway, so we had one of these preliminary hearings where the officer testified he couldn't disclose the location because people would die and children would, I don't know, perish. So we couldn't have the surveillance location. So we did get that he was 20 feet from where my client was alleged to have sold drugs, that he was elevated to about 5 inches, and he was not inside a house. He wasn't in somebody's home. That was essentially the information that we got from the preliminary hearing. So what did we do? We went out and played pin the tail on the surveillance location. And then here's how this went down at trial. Officer, can you mark where it was that my client would go when he would sell the drugs, or where you say he was when he sold the drugs? There, top of the driveway, back to the chair. Top of the driveway, back to the chair, all along being surveilled at 20 feet away. That's the only question for the officer, right? And once we get the 20 feet, once we get that he wasn't elevated or in somebody's house, and he makes that X, I am done with the surveillance location at the trial, because I have an investigator who's going to play pin the tail on the surveillance location. This is not to scale, but here's how this works. He goes out to the scene, and he draws a line. North, south, east, west, northeast, south, right? 8 points. 20 feet from the place that my client was alleged to have sold drugs. Not in a house. So either the police officer is selling drugs with him on the chair, or he's standing in the middle of the street this far away watching him sell drugs. Right? All of that without even having to confront the officer about his full of shit story of the surveillance location. And this was one of those cases that in closing argument, the jurors were literally looking at me like, why are you talking? And it was, I think, an 8-minute not guilty with no hassle from the police officer. Now later, I saw the police officer who got drunk at a bar and told me where the surveillance location was. And it turned out that his estimate of 20 feet, given at a time that he wasn't really thinking about the case, he wasn't really prepared, he should have said more like 35, 40 feet, because he was there was a little fence by where that red car is. He was standing behind that fence that had a hole in it, looking. But because he said 20 feet, and he never had a chance to clarify it, because the first time he ever saw this diagram was sitting in the audience at the closing argument, there was nothing he could do to restore his credibility. So pin the tail on the surveillance location is fun. You should do it in cases where they tell you where they are, which is you not have as many lines, but do it in cases where you're not sure where they were. If you can get a distance and a place your client was standing, you can do this. And most judges are going to give that to you even if the location is not fully disclosed. And sometimes it can be even more fun than having the surveillance location. All right, so another thing that we want to do in these cases is we want to mine inconsistencies. We want to make sure that we get every inconsistency, that we have a chart to keep track of everything this officer says about what happened, and we track it. And when we go to impeach the officer, we do not want to wait until the section he's talking about the thing to do the impeachment. We want to do all the impeachments up front and at once. So in a case involving officer credibility or a motion involving officer credibility, the first thing, if you have 35 impeachments for the officer, do all 35 of them before you do anything else. And here's the reason. It's easy for a jury or a judge to say, well, he was scared. Or, well, maybe he couldn't see that well. Or, well, when you're on impeachment number 5 or 6, they start to go, I can't forgive this many mistakes. That's how you turn somebody who's mistaken into a liar. You show all the times that they were inconsistent, one after the other after the other. This enables you to not only get the maximum value, it also enables you to now start impeaching on stuff that probably would be too small to impeach about. Left hand, right hand, blue jacket, purple jacket. You can stick those kind of towards the end and you could throw them in there. Now, the more impeachment you have, you do it up front. Now this jury, now those red jurors who were like, I believe all police officers, were like, oh, not really this one. And they're going to be more open to the rest of your arguments. Demeanor. I love this picture. Like whatever these guys are about to say next is a lie, right? I don't look at this demeanor. You want to start recording demeanor. There's Wigmore on evidence, which I don't typically walk around quoting, but there's a great quote about demeanor. The case is Dyer versus McDougal. That demeanor is part of the evidence. What do I mean by that? Officers often look like they're lying, and that is not captured on the record. And then we wait till the closing, or we wait until we're doing the oral argument, and we say things like, Judge, he just seemed like he was lying. And as it comes out of our mouth, we're like, that sounds so stupid, right? So how do we do it? I've started putting this in my trial notes for cops or in my motions. And if they just do something physically or use a voice that's really weird at a part that's inappropriate or something that I want to call out, I stick it here. And then later, I can say, Officer X crossed his arms and looked down towards his lap every time I asked him about the car. That happened, page 1, line whatever, page 2, line whatever, right? So you're telling the judge where in the transcript you saw this. Now, is the judge still free to accept or reject it? Sure, but it sure sounds a lot more facty when you do it this way, right? So, bias, officer bias. One thing I want you to remember is that bias is a story, and it's not enough to say he's a cop and therefore he's biased. Bias is a story about a lot of things. All of these are reasons police officers could be biased, and if we sat in this room, we could make slides and slides and slides of these. So you have to get at the heart of the bias. I'm going to give you a quick example. This is a case where a police officer goes to a scene of a robbery, and the person who stole the stuff is running away. Very clear, person running is the robber. Throws something while he's running, officer gives chase. Now, this took place in the town of Woodbridge, New Jersey, which you have no reason to know nothing happens in, okay? The officer was 12. He was like 12 years old, a really, really young officer. His partner was not 12 and had not run in a really long time, is the way I'm going to put it. And the 12-year-old quickly outran Officer Dunkin' Donuts. He said, the young officer says, I got to the clearing and I took a deep breath. Because when he got to the clearing, chasing this guy, they kind of went through the woods, they get to this clearing, and now he loses him. Loses the robber. So what does he do? He takes a breath. He said, I took a deep breath. And then he uses his radio, which is a very important device, right? Very important to have the radio. What does the radio do? It lets him communicate to dispatch, blah, 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 blah. He communicates to dispatch, and he says, black male, black hoodie. Great for me, because my client was a native of India, and he was wearing a gray windbreaker. So I need to make black man, black hoodie the greatest fact that ever existed. So I did this case with a co-counsel, and the way the co-counsel did the case was she went up to the jury, stood in front of the jury, and said, when you got to the clearing, you took a deep breath. right? Starts at that moment when everything needs to be right. The young officer who's working in a town where nothing happens, that needs to apprehend the person. Everything is riding on him because he just outran his older, more experienced partner. He has to get it right, right? So that's what I mean by thinking through bias, because that's not a negative bias. That's a positive one. We think of bias as, is this cop dirty? Bias can come from a really positive place. A cop could be biased because he's afraid, right? I recently went to, don't ask how I got in, that's a long story, to a class called Crime Scene for Patrol Officers. And there's actual photograph of me in this class. I'm on the bottom left, right? Fox in the hen house. Like there I am in Crime Scene for Patrol Officers, where they decided not to tell the patrol officers I was there because they wanted them to be free to speak. Like, okay, sounds good. But one of the things they talked about, and it was something I never thought about, was one of the officers raised his hand. They had a section on personal protective equipment, what you wear when you go into a crime scene. And one of the officers said, you know, when I went to this one scene one time and there were a lot of needles everywhere, there were bed bugs everywhere. And I opened the door and I knew I had to go in, but my office couldn't afford the equipment that I needed to go in. So I had to wait for like an hour and a half for the equipment to come. But then something had happened in the house where some evidence had gotten destroyed somehow. And I'm like, what a better way, like what a great way to cross. To talk about that officer's fear of bringing that home to his family, about the conflict that he was in, all come from a place of wanting to protect himself and his loved ones and what he might take home from that scene. That's not negative at all. That's human, it's positive. And I'd much rather stand up in front of those red jurors and say he did it for his family than say he did it because he's a liar. I don't want to go to Mach 5 liar unless I absolutely need to. So I want to talk a little bit, how much time do I have? Okay. What? No, stop. I want to talk about priming behavior for a few minutes. So priming behavior, and I'm going to skip over some other stuff, but priming behavior is something that I think it's important for us to understand, and we don't talk about it enough. Priming behavior is about an officer's expectation about the presence or absence of factors in the field that might inform their responses. And there's been some great work on this done by Paul Taylor, who's at John Jay, and is a former cop who's now doing social science research in this area. And what he's found is that when the less information that the officers are presented with when they go to a scene, the more likely they are to rely on heuristics, which is short-term for their assumptions. And what are their assumptions informed by? The dispatch, the 911, crime statistics in the area, whether it's a high crime area, policies, their supervision, right? That's where that comes from. There was a study that was done, and I loved this study, and it was the officers in it were put in a simulator, and they were told that they had to go to a scene and the suspect had a gun. And then they were kind of put in a situation where they sort of had to shoot. 62% of the officers who were told the suspect had a gun fired. 28% of the control group that were told nothing about whether or not the suspect was carrying something fired. But here is the statistic that I found really interesting. 6% of those told the suspect was talking on the phone fired, right? So what they're told about what is going on is going to inform their perspective. So how does that help us? What about the high crime area? I don't know what this guy is doing or why there's a high crime area in the bushes, right? But there's a high crime area. So there's a wonderful attorney in our office who's working with Professor Fagan, who you heard about yesterday in Allison's talk, on we're trying to attack high crime area in New Jersey. This whole idea that any cop testifying actually knows what he's saying when he says high crime area. And I was consulting with Tamara because she worked with Professor Fagan. She's smart. She went to Yale. She's one of these super smart appellate lawyers. And she said, I'm going to give you tips on how to make the record that we need for high crime area. I said, oh, shoot, right, I'm ready. I'm going to write it down. She said, you need to ask questions in a couple categories. I was like, okay. What is high? What is crime? What is area? And I was like, they gave you a degree from Yale for that? Like, really? But what does she mean? In order to be high, there has to be a baseline. Higher than what? The precinct next door? The town next door? The state? How does the officer even know that? The type and nature of the crime in the question will be, so the crime itself, right? What type of crime? Are we comparing a drug crime to all crimes or drug crimes to drug crimes? How does this cop know that he does it? And then the area. What's the area? Be specific. What area are we talking about? Your patrol area? The precinct? What are we talking about? And do this in leading questions, no open-ended questions about this stuff. Leading. You do not know. You have never read. You have never calculated, right? Those kinds of questions. All right, I'm going to skip over systemic arguments, not because I think they're super important, but because it's pretty well outlined in the paper in your materials. And I want to get to stuff that's a little bit less well documented. But the short form of systemic arguments, meaning arguing racial profiling that a single police officer is acting in a manner consistent with racial profiling, the very short story is ignore everything else I've just said. Start small, get your ammunition from that when nobody's looking, and then argue it at the end. And the reason for that is if you make it too obvious too soon, the judge is going to go, whoa, who are you calling a racist? Not this cop who I have to see every week, right? So you want to do the opposite. And there's some materials in your handouts that cover that. I'm going to skip over all this. This is just an example from a motion to suppress. And that's in the documents. We want to be aware of rules and procedures. Cops love rules, therefore we love rules, right? And one thing I just want to say about priming behavior really quickly that I didn't mention is you want to think about ways that you can also use priming behavior to your advantage. Like high crime area is one that generally is going to work against us. But priming behavior, things like proactive patrol, do your cops say that? They say that in Newark. I was on proactive patrol. What does that mean? It means you're going out and looking and assuming everything is criminal. So just because scientifically you may not want to talk about priming behavior, you might not make a big challenge like you would to high crime area, you still can argue to the jury the common sense of it. If you're out there looking for crimes, you're probably going to find them. That's a common sense argument you can make to a jury. So when you look at the list of priming behaviors, you want to think about that too. How can you use them for the forces of good, right? So procedures, cops like, well, you got to get every standard operating procedure. You have to get every procedure that could even remotely apply to the stop in your case, to what they did, from the evidence collection procedures to preserving the scene. Because a lot of times, particularly in high volume case areas, they treat drug crime scenes like they're not important. And if you can whip out the standard operating procedures for what they're supposed to do for a crime scene, like the homicide crime scene stuff, and kind of apply it to drug cases, it makes them sound like they didn't do a lot of stuff. And procedures are fun because you can do some things with them. This is our standard operating procedure that says it's mandatory to record all traffic stops. And if you don't record the traffic stop, you have to write reports. If something malfunctions with your camera, you have to write reports. So I had a case where the officer gave 7 or 8 different explanations for why his body camera failed. 8 times, 8 different, over 3 days of testimony, 8 different excuses for why his microphone wasn't on. Was I going to fight about which one of those excuses was true? I don't care. Why? Because I had the operating procedures, and I could say to the judge, pick one. I don't care which one of his excuses you pick. They all violated the operating procedures. And you pick the chart, and you put it in the PowerPoint. You take the chart, you can put it in a written motion. Say, I don't care, Judge. You decide which one of those things is true. Regardless, they violate the procedures. So I'm going to end by just talking about some possible solutions to these problems of police officers getting away with stuff. Aggressive discovery practice. You're going to hear today from Chief Findling, who's going to talk to you about using social media to find out stuff about police. Talk to other people in your office about police. Get transcripts of when they testified. Get their resumes if they have them. Get whatever you can on them that might be useful. Every award they've ever won, all sorts of stuff. You also want to do, if your state has a formal police accountability project, you want to contribute to it. If they don't, you can start making a database in your office or within attorneys in your local jurisdiction where you pull together transcripts and you pull together information you learn about police officers and put it somewhere where you can access it later. I keep files when I was working in a trial practice. I would keep a file on every department. And every time I would just see something interesting, I'd just stick it in the file. So I remember one time I saw this thing, we got a new ballistics machine. And they were advertising on their Facebook page, new ballistics machine. I said, that's nice. I'm gonna stick this in my file in case I have a case where they use the old one, right? So I don't know, and I never had a case where they used the old one, but I thought maybe this could come in handy someday. Whether it's good, bad, or ugly, stick it in a file somewhere, and then just flip through it when you have an officer from that department or you have that police officer. Keep a stash somewhere. And then finally, oh, that was like a not intended joke, like keep a stash, get it? The drug seminar? All right. So legislative and policy change, finally we want to advocate for legislative and policy changes that give us true police transparency, right? That give us access to police disciplinary records and departmental files and things like that. So in closing, what I want to say to you is this. So this is Cynthia Roseberry. For those of you who do not know her, she's a phenomenal presenter. You've probably seen her scrolling around on the screen because there's like a best of Cynthia Roseberry thing that you can buy, and she's wonderful. And she is fond of saying something that I think is particularly true in these kinds of cases. We as criminal defense attorneys are forced to deal with some of the lowest people on earth, people who have no sense of right and wrong, people who will lie in court to get what they want, people who do not care who gets hurt in the process. And it is our job and our sworn duty to protect our clients from those people.